Okay, so now we're recording. Okay, so this first section is looking a bit at the background of the UN. And you can see here the picture of the United Nations on that kind of the map of the world from above on this baby blue background with, I don't know if anyone knows what that is, but those are laurels, the peace laurels, which kind of comes from ancient Greek mythology. This idea of its organization of peace, and baby blue is a kind of a peaceful color, but also it's a map of the world where there's no nations there. It's a map of the world from directly above. And so it's trying to not be kind of nationalistic or colonial or whatever, just to show this is what the world looks like as if it's unified. Now, in terms of the background, there's, we could have a whole course on the background of the United Nations. But of course it really starts with the League of Nations, but even then it starts with the Concert of Europe back in the 1800s, which is a kind of organization of European powers. But really, as an organization, it starts with the League of Nations, formed after World War I, pretty much with the same objective of the United Nations, that is to kind of create peace and to organize the world. As we know, the League of Nations failed for a number of reasons. It failed because it wasn't strong enough. It failed because it wasn't inclusive enough. And it failed because it didn't have enough powerful tools to stop the war. So it only lasted, 20 years before World War II intervened. But it's important to look at the League of Nations because the faults made in the League of Nations, they tried to fix that with the United Nations. So when we look at how it's structured, you'll see that parts of it kind of reflect either a carry on from the League of Nations or a new development from the League of Nations. Okay, so the UN was formulated kind of during World War II to the end of World War II, when the Allied powers realized they were going to win and they wanted to set up an organization founded on peace, which would ensure there was no more World War II. So it was formed in San Francisco, where the UN Charter was signed by about 50 countries. It was actually 50 countries, and then another one joined a couple of months later. But in 26th of June 1945, the 50 countries, and that was basically the 50 countries of the world, or the 50 countries on the winning side of World War II, signed the UN Convention. Now, in the world in total, then there's probably only about 60 or 70 countries. And so the world was a lot smaller and a lot more colonial as well, because most of the countries that have joined since then to form the 193 countries have been colonies. Again, there's a picture of the Philippines, which was there signing the charter in 1945. And this is just a picture of the New York Times, the International New York Times, but the Herald Tribune then, which is about the signing of the charter. But you can see there that the war is still going on. They're talking about B-29s bombing Japanese war plants, and then the Reichsgold being seized. And so the war is still going on when it adopts the charter. Okay. Now, the UN Charter is kind of like the constitution of the UN, and it sets it up. And so it's a couple of important points we need to look at the constitution, because this describes the structure and kind of the politics, and also then how human rights fits in. Because what's interesting is one of the key purposes of the United Nations is human rights. But they were sort of inventing it then. Human rights didn't really exist as we know it now before the United Nations. But the UN Charter in point 1.2 says the purpose of the United Nations is to achieve international cooperation, solving international problems of economic, social, and cultural humanitarian character, and this is the important bit, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Okay, so this is the first time human rights is mentioned as a purpose of the United Nations, and then also kind of non-discrimination is put into that as well. Okay. Now, when we look at how the UN then is drafted, and how the UN Charter is drafted and how that forms the UN, they gave it kind of 6 purposes. So one is peaceful settlement of disputes. The next one's friendly relations between nations, which is the first one, peaceful settlement of disputes through diplomatic arbitration and enforcement. This is kind of what the UN Security Council does. So if you look at that sheet and you look at the organs, we all know the UN Security Council, and that's its main job, is to try and stop wars. Friendly relations between states, that's mainly the General Assembly, where all the states of the world come together to discuss issues. They provide international justice system and international law for treaties and so on. That's primarily the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. So you see that's another organ. And the ICJ actually comes out of the League of Nations. So that was formed for the League of Nations, passed on to the United Nations. Then support the development and self-determination of countries. That's the Trusteeship Council. Well, it's one of the roles of the Trusteeship Council, to guide kind of countries through their into having governance and maybe out of colonialism into independence. And then economic and social development, that's ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. Again, you'll see that is another organ. Then you have support of human rights. Now, what's unique about human rights is that doesn't get an organ. You know, development, self-determination, peace and law all get organs, but human rights didn't get an organ. That got a commission. The last one is trusteeship states. So trusteeship states is states that were like colonies of Germany and Japan and Italy, that once the war was over, they didn't have anyone to kind of look after them. But the last trusteeship state, which was I think the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, became a country in the 1990s. There's no more trusteeship states. Okay. Now, last bit of the kind of the technical legal part of the charter is it's important to look at, there are these fundamental concepts which underpin the logic of the United Nations. And it also makes it different from, say, the League of Nations. The first one is that all countries are equal. Now this is all countries, sorry, to be precise, all countries are equal in law. That means that if you're a country, you have exactly the same legal status as any other country. So like Tuvalu, which is the smallest country in the world, is probably about the same size as Chulalongkorn University, you know, both probably in the amount of land and the number of people, has exactly the same legal status as China, with 1 billion people and a big country. Now, while obviously they differ in terms of their economic and military power, legally they have exactly the same rights. Now, what this is trying to avoid is that during the League of Nations and before that, you had a whole lot of different types of countries. You had, you know, like colonial powers, and you had colonies, and you had trusteeships, and you had protectorates, you know, all this kind of hierarchy of countries with their different legal status. And they wanted to get rid of that and say, no, you're either a country or you're not, and that's that. Another important part is the peaceful settlement of disputes, which means that countries should always try and have diplomacy before war. As this is the practice of the Security Council and the General Assembly, that states that war should be avoided. In fact, the next one's quite important. The UN Charter makes war illegal. For the first time in history, that if you go to war, that's a crime. Now, before that, war was a right of states. If you wanted to start a war, that was up to you. You could do it anytime and anywhere. There's nothing wrong with that. But gradually the world changed. You had these various laws like the Kellogg-Briand Pact in the 1930s and other kind of pacts of peace and so on to say that we shouldn't start war. What the UN Charter says is that war is illegal. You start a war, that's a crime, and you're going to face consequences for that. Now, the next fundamental concept, this is not all the fundamental concepts, it's just the important ones, is the non-interference in domestic affairs. The United Nations should not interfere in what's considered domestic. Now, this can be problematic nowadays because really nothing is domestic. Whether you look at the economy or the military or education or anything like that, they all have international elements. You know, like even the MAIDS program, it has international elements in the sense that it's structured along international course lines. It has international quality assurance, international students. So it's very hard to determine now what domestic affairs is. But this is the main argument that many states use about their human rights standards. They say, no, this is not an international issue, this is domestic. You can't interfere in what we do. So Duterte says that about the war on crime, the war on drugs. Myanmar says that about what's going on in Rakhine State. Thailand says that about its democracy. that no, this is domestic, don't interfere. Whereas human rights are not domestic issues. That countries, if they've ratified the UN Charter, they agree to abide by the laws of the UN Charter, which means that human rights is international, it's not domestic. Okay, I'll pause there.